Authentication and resources. In this nugget, we'll start off by discussing authentication issues, and then we'll discuss resources. And as with many of the other things that we address, much of the troubleshooting related to these is the proper configuration in the first place. But one of the things that we'll need to understand is some common terms that we'll have to get established as a groundwork. We'll also talk about credentials, how some of that has changed within Windows Vista and could affect other applications that you've had written in the past. Also, we'll take a look at permissions for various resources, mostly file and folder resources, and how we can address potential, what might seem like potential conflicts within those permissions, and how we can identify what effective permissions are that take place. Now then, before we get started, let's go ahead and address, first of all, some key terms, just so that we can make sure that we're on the same page and we don't have any misunderstandings as to what's what in this whole list. And this is not a comprehensive list of all things related to access and so forth. This is just a good starter point. Now, one of the first terms you want to understand is authentication, which is sometimes mixed up with authorization. They sound a lot alike, and sometimes you can use them almost synonymously, but there actually is a distinction between how these two are used. First of all, authentication is simply an identifier of who I am. Okay, this is me, except I don't have any hair. But anyway, this is a person. This identifies my identity. Normally, we confirm that by our username and password login, although, of course, you can use something like a fingerprint reader or some other kind of authentication scheme as well. And then the other thing that you would have here is, once I've identified who I am, then I will have authorization attempts that take place thereafter. Once I've identified who I am, and maybe if I'm a member of any groups, then if I want to access something like a folder, well, I have to have my user account in an ACL or an access control list on that folder, and that has to be either my user account or a group that I'm a membership of. And if I'm in that list, then I'm authorized. I have authorization to be able to access that. So this is who I am. This is whether or not I have permission. And then the list that identifies whether or not I have permission would be called an access control list, or just an ACL is sometimes what we call that as well. And then if I want to add somebody else into that list, maybe they're not already there, or I need to add someone else, then I can add an access control entry, or an ACE, into the ACL. So this would just be an ACE. Again, this is one of those things you don't necessarily have to memorize it, but you will see it in white papers, documentation, help files, and other things, and so you'll want to kind of understand what they are. But again, these sometimes are also used just synonymously, and for most purposes, that's probably okay. And then there's also NTFS. This is just the file system that all current versions of Windows use. Windows 2000, XP, Vista, Windows Server 2003 and 2008 all use NTFS as the preferred file system because it's going to be more secure, and that's where we're able to add items into an access control list or entry. This is really not a FAT or a FAT32 item. Don't confuse that, by the way, with sharing permissions and things like that. That's a little bit different. We'll be addressing that as we go as well. But right now we're mostly sticking with file system permissions. And then there's also an issue of object auditing. When you have access to resources, maybe a sensitive folder that has confidential documents in it, you might want to know who's accessing those documents. When are they accessing them? Which user accounts are they? And which user accounts are attempting to access these resources when they're not supposed to be. So you can do something called object auditing on those things, and you can do that for folders or for individual files if you want. You can also do it for any other kind of an object, such as a printer, if you like. And then finally, we don't do this quite as often, but you can even audit things like registry portions of the registry, like registry keys or specific items within it. So let's take a look at the first thing first, credentials. This really relates to the authentication, where we can identify that someone is who they say they are, and then once they have done that, then they are authorized to be able to access a resource. Just like if a police officer comes to the door, shows you his badge, he's authenticated who he is, and then he has the ability, if he has a warrant or something like that, to come into the house, which actually just happened. Okay, not to my house, but this is what happened. This was really exciting. This happened last week. I heard a huge noise, and I thought it was something coming from upstairs. My wife's remodeling one of the rooms up there, and I thought something fell over. So I go up there, look around, and I don't see anything, and I look out the back window from my bedroom window, and I see this guy over the wall, and there's another SWAT guy over here, and this is the Peoria Police Department. I live in Phoenix, but there was a Peoria police action, and they were serving a drug-related search warrant on my next-door neighbor. Wow, it's just a renter guy who had just moved in recently, and wasn't I the lucky one? But anyway, they had thrown in, actually they shot in a flashbang grenade and smashed it through the window, and it was so loud, I couldn't believe how loud it was. Even in my home office, I could hear it through the walls. It was just amazing how loud that was. So anyway, this is just kind of for fun. Hang with me here for a minute, folks. So I see these guys over the back wall, and I only see two of them. I say, well, usually there's more than just two SWAT team officers, isn't there? I look out the front window, my front door, and there's this. There's a bunch of undercover police officers there, and then to the right there's the SWAT van, da-da-da, da-da-da, and all that kind of stuff. So that was quite a lot of fun. And then I got out and I looked out the driveway, and there's all these cars on the street. Guess what? They're all unmarked police cars because my neighborhood doesn't allow parking on the street. So anyway, there's all these unmarked police cars down the street, and just some more pictures here. I was able to get behind them. I actually talked to a couple of the officers. They told me to stay back behind this SUV there, that dark SUV that you see there. And then as things started to calm down, the SWAT team guys left. They hopped back over the fence. There's their machine guns, of course, and everything. And there's some SWAT guys there in the front yard of my neighbors. I've tried to, I'll show you here as well, after everything calmed down, all the SWAT guys gathered around, they were discussing different stuff, and they were there most of the day serving this search warrant, and it was pretty exciting, actually. And here's one of the undercover police officers, and I've, of course, obscured his identity for obvious reasons, so there we have that. Anyway, overall, a pretty exciting day, a lot of SWAT guys, machine guns, battering rams, they smashed in the front door, all kinds of stuff, a really butch action going on there. Actually, that's my daughter's cat. I'm not quite sure how that picture got in there. But that was my attack kitten. Just in case some serious action took place over there, we were going to sick the kitty on them. Anyway, all that SWAT team stuff was kind of a lame excuse to show you here in the credentials item, but I had to show it to somebody because it was pretty exciting. And hey, after all, I'm just a geek and I sit in my office all day and don't talk to people, so you're the lucky one. All right, folks, we also have a rewritten GINA within Windows Vista. Now, this is really just trivial until you consider the fact that it could really significantly affect other things that we have, such as certain biometric devices or token-based authentication. A biometric might be something like, a fingerprint scanner, which is becoming increasingly common on laptops right now. I have an IBM, well, actually, it's, I guess, a Lenovo ThinkPad or something like that, and it has a really good scanner in it, which has been designed to work with Windows Vista's new GINA, because it's been totally rewritten. My wife, on the other hand, has a laptop that ran great with XP with its fingerprint scanner, but because it doesn't have a new version of the GINA that works with Windows Vista's, her fingerprint scanner doesn't work anymore now that I've upgraded her to Windows Vista. She's kind of saying, gee, thanks a lot for the upgrade there, James. Now I have to memorize these impossibly convoluted passwords you make me use. All right. Anyway, so we have that now. Also, other biometrics might include things such as iris scanners. For example, I was at a location just last week. It wasn't like a secure government location or something like that, but it was actually an exclusive club, I guess, for the high society folks, and they actually had an iris scanner there that would allow you to gain access to that room. Of course, I was the computer geek, so I didn't have access because I'm not really the one that gets invited to all the hot parties out there in Scottsdale and all that. But that's okay. My feelings aren't hurt, not really. Then we also have tokens. Things like tokens are going to be, smart cards, or sometimes there's some type of a USB-based token where it'll have a certificate on it, and that will also allow you to log on. Again, there might be a piece of software that's been written to work with a specific device beyond just the device driver, a specific piece of software that interfaces with that driver and presents some kind of a logon screen to the user. Well, since the GINA has been rewritten, those pieces of software might not work anymore with these. You'll have to wait for the updated version from your manufacturer. And then, here's another thing before I move on, though. Because of the rewritten GINA, it's much easier for manufacturers to write new software for Windows Vista because they've totally redone the way that's done now, and they basically just have to plug into Windows Vista existing code, and beyond that, I'm not going to go into all the programming of it, but most of the vendors are really liking the new Vista for all of that, because it's going to substantially reduce their burden on writing their own customized GINAs to get these devices to work. Now, Credential Manager. You've seen those websites and, maybe when you map to Drive and stuff like that, where it'll ask you to enter in your credentials, a username and a password of some type, and usually there's a checkbox there that will say, memorize this login or something like that. And then just by way of example, you've gone to websites before that ask you for a username and a password, for example. Maybe it's a membership that you have to pay for or whatever. Well, this is the kind of thing you'll see. This is actually, I had to block it out. This is a website that someone actually has me administer, so I didn't want to reveal all the goodies here. But anyway, enter in the username, and then enter in a password. And when you choose Remember My Password, that's when it's going to go ahead and store it in the Credential Manager, which you can access in Control Panel. Now, I didn't actually store it in this particular Credential Manager, but you'll see here as I show you where we go to the Control Panel, User Accounts, and User Accounts again, that over here on the left, there's this Manage Your Network Passwords, and then any of the websites that I've accessed and so forth will appear here. If I want to add more, I can do that, www.myweb.com, and then I enter in, of course, a username and a password and specify that as a website or program credential as opposed to a Windows logon. I would choose a Windows logon if it was some other kind of a resource, like this has a lot of file shares on it, for example, and I've accessed that one over the network. And this would be the case also if you map a network drive and it requires logon credentials from maybe a different domain. It won't recognize your existing logon credentials. Well, Windows attempts to use the ones you have by default, but if they don't work, then it will ask you to enter in manually the credentials, and those will again be things that you can choose to store here as well. Now, the time where this will not work is if you go to a logon page, and this is usually the case with financial institutions and banks and places like that. Here, for example, let me just try to find one. If I go over here to, not CBT Nuggets, we're not a bank. We have Gold Nuggets, but no, we're not a bank. Then what we'll have here is something like www.wellsfargo.com. And if they have a web page where when you log into their website, it doesn't actually bring up the pop-up dialog box, which is not really that good of a security practice, but if it has on the web page like this, those will not be stored in the Credential Manager, so that's going to be a different issue, and that will not be stored there. Alright, now let's go ahead and address also permissions as it relates to usually file and folder resources. Now, the first thing we'll have is share permissions. Sometimes we talk about a file share. There's really no such thing. There's only a folder share. You don't share individual files. You share a folder, and then any of the contents of that folder can also then be accessible through the folder share. These are only valid over the network. So if I just open up Windows Explorer here and I just browse my local file system, there's really no way to set up some kind of a share in here with this, or to access this as a share, because I'm accessing these folders locally and not over the network. So this is a network-only idea. Now, as far as the permissions go, they're often very broad, and then you will tighten down the security and the access using NTFS permissions, which I'll discuss next. And so that's what we'll often do with these, because you might have a folder that has a number of different people and groups that can access it, but you only want specific people to be able to change some folders but not others, and more granular that way, and we'll do that with NTFS permissions. Well, as we take a look at NTFS permissions, these will work both over the network, but again, you have to access it first through the share. So this is kind of door number one that you have to access this stuff through. And then as you go through door number one, then you'll hit the NTFS permissions. They'll work both over the network and locally. And again, they're much more specific usually than the general share permissions that we see. Now, sometimes they might also conflict. What if the share permission over the network says that I want everyone to have full control, but the NTFS permissions on the specific folder or files say that everyone has read-only access? Well, then what happens? Which one of these two will win? As a general rule of thumb, whichever of these two is most restrictive always wins. Okay, that's just the way it is. Whichever one is more restrictive. Let's also take a look at what happens within conflicting or differing permissions within a share and within NTFS. Here I might have a share. Maybe this is my, my folder that I've decided to share out. And everyone, I'll just abbreviate it every, because my sloppy handwriting here, but everyone has, let's say, read access to this folder. On the other hand, I'm a member of the Phoenix admins group. Okay, Phoenix admins security group, which has full control over that same folder. So I'm a member of the Everyone security group because everyone's a member of the Everyone security group, hence the name. But I also happen to be a member of the Phoenix admins security group. So which one of these do I get? Well, here it's cumulative. So I start off with the read permission, but because I'm a member of this security group, I have full control permission. Generally, the way you look at this is whichever one of these has the most liberal permission is the one you get. If I have differing permissions within the same share. Okay, so in this case, I'd have full control permission. whereas every other reader would have only every other user would only have read permission. Same thing applies on NTFS permissions. Maybe I've got an individual document maybe with NTFS permissions assigned to it on the access control list. And here, maybe I have, again, everyone, or it could be authenticated users, but I'll just use everyone again. Maybe they have read-only access here. On the NTFS permissions, though, the Phoenix admins, once again, they have full control permission on this same document. What do I get? The more liberal between these two. Okay, so that's the way that kind of thing works. Now let's also take a look at what happens if there appears to be a conflict here. For example, up here I have Phoenix admins with full control on the share permission, but down here at Phoenix admins I've erased the full control, and maybe I change that. Maybe now it's the modify permission. Modify still allows the administrators to change the documents and so forth, but they cannot do additional things such as changing the ownership or changing the security permissions on it now. So this is going to be a little bit more restrictive than what this permission is. In this case, what happens? I combine these permissions. The net result of these two would be full control for Phoenix admins. Okay. Now the combined permission for these two is going to be modify permission for Phoenix admins. Okay. And then what I do is I compare this with this, and the most restrictive of the two wins. Modify is more restrictive than full control, so the cumulative permission between the share and NTFS permissions, and that's what we're looking at here, share versus NTFS permissions, is going to be the more restrictive, which is the modify permissions. Now, this can get to be confusing sometimes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can look at the effect of permissions when you combine the two without having to do any mental gymnastics trying to calculate all that out. So here I'm going to go ahead and take a look at a share, and we'll just use this as an example. First of all, to create the share, I've got a folder that's already there, and I'm going to right-click now to choose Share. Having done that, we have a different interface than you might have been accustomed to in previous versions of Windows. I'm going to choose Everyone here, but you could also choose Find, and you could browse for Active Directory objects. I'm just going to use Everyone for our current example. And then I'll just click on Add here and make the determination of what kind of permission I want them to have. By default, they'll have read-only permission, or reader. This is just to make it more identifiable to the casual user as to what their permission is. But this would be the read permission. I could also make them a contributor or co-owner. Co-owner, which would give them pretty much the same permission as this administrative account down here, which is the owner. I'll make them a contributor in this case, and then I'll click on Share to allow this to take place and click on Continue. And sure enough, now I click on Done, and now we see that we have a little icon there that identifies that as a shared resource. Now, if I right-click instead and go to Properties in this Sharing tab, this is just a little bit more specific. I could go back to the same kind of thing I just looked at by clicking there and choosing Change Share Permissions. This gives me the same thing I just saw. Or I could go down here to Advanced Sharing and then continue through User Account Control. And then here I could look at the specific permissions here. And again, we can choose Share here and just give it a different share name if we want to. By default, there's 10 users that can access a client operating system. Servers, you can go to unlimited, up to the available resources. For here, I'll choose Permissions, and now this might look more familiar to you. So here, when we have them in this permission, then we see that everyone has the change permission as opposed to a co-contributor. The co-contributor, again, is just more colloquial, a friendlier way, I can't say friendlier, a friendlier way of looking at the change permission and more that casual users might be able to identify. All right, so here I'm going to leave this unchanged, so I'll just cancel out of it all. It's just staying exactly the way it was before. But rather than closing this out, now I'm going to go to the security permissions as well, and we'll just mix this up a little bit. Here I'm going to go to the advanced permissions, and for the everyone, rather than having the modify permission, I'm going to go to edit this, and now I'm going to change everyone, and I'll again choose edit. And now I'm going to give them a more restrictive permission. Rather than giving them the change permission there, maybe I'm going to give them something like a read-only permission. Let me just clear all these off of here. And I'll go down to a read-only permission here. Okay, so they only have read now. All right, and then I'll click OK, and then I'll click on OK again. Now, once I've done that, it might get a little bit confusing. Okay, the share permissions, if I go back to those, that one gave us, and I'll just go up here, this would give us everyone had contributor access, which means they could modify documents. Okay, canceling out of that, going back to the security tab. Now, here everyone has read-only permission. Okay, and it's listed under special permissions because I went to the advanced button to be able to make that. But you see here that it's read permissions, and we did not inherit that. We explicitly granted that permission, which is another reason why it appears under this list. Now, it might get confusing. Wow, but by the time you get to the end of the day, what do they actually have? Do they have read-only access or the ability to change the documents? But if I go to effective permissions and I choose the everyone security group here, I'll select that. I'll go to everyone. Then what do they have? And then I'll go down here and I'll look and it'll tell me the net result by the time I combine the shared and the NTFS permissions is they have read permissions. This is much easier than having to do complicated calculations in my head or getting out a pen and paper and trying to figure it out. So as we get back to our whiteboard here, that's what I just showed you. The Effective Permissions tab makes this much easier to work with. And then there's also a matter of auditing. Sometimes you need to be able to keep track of who's accessing what kinds of resources. Let me quickly go ahead and show you how to perform that as well. Now in the enterprise, normally we'll administer auditing from a group policy object. Maybe we want to turn on auditing capability for all of our file servers. Well, we could do that on an enterprise level. But for our purposes, I just went to a start, and then I typed in here gpedit.msc, which opens up the local group policy editor. And you can make note of where I went here to gain access to the audit policy, where I'll go to the audit object access, and this will give me the ability to audit registry locations, printers, and of course files and folders. And I'm going to audit failure and or success, just depending on which I want. Success will also probably result in a much larger event log because most people that access resources do so successfully. Here, I want to audit failure in case I want to see a pattern of someone trying to hack into something. And they keep trying different passwords, for example, or something, and keep failing. I'll just leave both on for now, and then I'll go to a specific share where I'll turn on auditing for a document. Now, by default, I've turned on the ability to audit, but I have not actually turned on eddy auditing quite yet. So what I need to do here is to go to the Security tab and to enable auditing by going to the Advanced button, and then going to Auditing here, and then continuing through User Account Control, and then seeing anytime someone is able to access that resource. Now here I'd already done that offline, where I'd added, and you just click on Add, and you type in somebody's name, or a group, or whatever, and then I've added this in here. I want to see anytime they do anything to this. So in this case I left on Full Control, which means anytime I basically touch that folder or that file at all, it's going to see all of this. So I'll enter in this here, and I'll say, the Hulk or something like that. I don't know. Other movies that I might like. So I've modified that document now. Now, once I've done that, I should be able to go to the event log and see events that have been spit out as a result of my turning on auditing for that resource. So to check that auditing, let's go ahead and look at the event log by right-clicking my computer and choosing Manage. Having done that, I'm going to go up here to the event log, if I expand this all out, to the event viewer, and then Windows logs and security. Now, this is a highly populated list. I mean, there's a whole bunch of items within this list. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And trying to find the exact one where I access that folder can be a little bit difficult. Fortunately, now in Windows Server 2008 as well as Windows Vista, we have the ability to find things and to do a number of other functions here that make the event log much easier to access. I'm just going to click Find for right now, and I was trying to access that movie file or whatever it was, so I'll just type in movie. That's part of the file name, and then cancel here, and it should have taken me to that specific item, and there it is. So as I double click on this, or you can make it easier to read by doing this, then I'll scroll down through here and it says this was an attempt to access that particular document. And that's what it says right up there. An attempt was made to access the object, who accessed it, when they accessed it. All different kinds of things are listed in this here. So this is very useful in terms of the new event log management. Because I can do that find function. I can also filter the current log and to try to filter against only a certain number of things. Maybe I only want to see informational messages or critical errors or things like that. I can specify as well which event log I want. Right now I'm focused on the security event log, so it kind of grays out and forces me to go to that one. But I could also go a higher level up over here to Windows log, and if I select that, then it allows me to select any of the other logs here as well. Then I can do the event sources. So for example, I could choose any one of these kinds of things. For example, here we saw the source. Whatever appears in that column, I can enter that in here as well as any event IDs. So you can see here we get quite a bit of information here, and we can sort against a specific given user or computer, all kinds of things that will make this a little bit easier for us. For example, 4663 was the, I think that's what it was. 4663 was the event ID that I just worked with. So I'll just go say, maybe I want to find other audit items for that. Well, I'll click OK here, and then it will show me any of the other event IDs with that number in it. Except that sometimes you'll see an impossible filter. For example, what I have here is 0 events. Well, maybe I did that to teach you a lesson, okay? Here's what you got to do. By filtering on what I did, I looked for a critical event with that event ID. There was no such thing. All I had was a very ordinary item to access that. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to filter the current log again and turn off the critical item and click OK. And now I'll see a whole bunch more appear where I was attempting to access that object, and we see that all those things were happening earlier today. In this nugget, we took a look at authentication and also resources. We started off by talking about some common authentication terms relating to authentication itself, authorization, some of the other things that we want to make sure that we don't confuse or mix up. We also talked about the credentials that are being used right now. Remember, there's a number of different ways of logging on, just using a normal username and a password, for example. But you may also, because of the new GINA that's been written, have problems with down-level utilities that have been written for smart cards or other kind of token-based authentication and things like that. So it could be some real troubleshooting issues relating to that you might need to wait for the vendor on. We also took a look at the actual permissions themselves on both files and folders for share permissions as well as for NTFS permissions, and how to kind of detangle all of that with the net effective permissions if you get into a confusing situation there. And then we also took a look at how we can audit access to those resources. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.